Hi. I'm going to be talking about this week's reading on the Injihu Home Language Program, and I'll start with a question because I'm subversive like that. The text brings up the common claim that teaching has nothing to do with politics. Do you think that the Australian education system has a specific responsibility to Indigenous students in Australia? If so, why, and in what ways can we fulfill that responsibility? Personally, I definitely think part of one's responsibility as a teacher here is to work to overcome years of institutional policy and attitude that have contributed to the poor educational performances of Indigenous students in Australia. And like Turner says, there are a lot of obstacles to classroom success, but for teachers of Indigenous students, these obstacles are compounded by a political atmosphere that necessarily colors all decisions. So to paraphrase the reading's definition of marginalization, it's a process which privileges certain people and beliefs over others, leaving the rest unheard. And a study by the National Review of Education for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people showed that on average, Indigenous children have lower levels of achievement in literacy and numeracy than other Australian students, which indicates a clear gap in educational outcomes and shows that Indigenous students aren't getting as much out of Australian schools, which were found by a royal commission to be either unwilling or unable to accommodate the needs of the Indigenous students, which of course limits their participation and achievement in formal education, in turn limiting the life options available to them. So the reading examines this in the context of Indigenous identity as a construct of society, having been marginalized according to that construct. So even the language itself of statements like the Royal Commission statement that I just said, puts Indigenous students in this space of the other. It says they haven't been accommodated, like special treatment or favors haven't been given to these different students, as if we have a right to treat them like a problem, as if we didn't steal the foundations of everything we're willing from them and then tell them their education was inferior and ours could serve them better. LOL. But no, it's true that the status quo that's maintained in school systems also maintains Torres Strait Island and Aboriginal identity as other, because education is obviously such a big part of socialization, and historically, Indigenous people were denied access to the white society that got to be constructed as superior. Turner says, the race of the dominant group is normalized, as if they're something outside culture and politics and simply represent society. I'm sure you can see why that's dangerous. They've been placed outside of the norm, which naturalizes the dominant group and represents them as a deviant group. And the reading brings up a quote by this dude bro called Nakata. He says, expressing the various problems in terms of the other, the national policy creates a specific demand for intervention. The dominant group must solve to act the problems. Wait, what? The dominant group must act to solve the problems. Sorry. So, yeah, if teachers see these differences and these students as a problem, their response is going to be to compensate and remediate. And part of in the process of this response, what's been common to a lot of policies is the stereotyping of student characteristics. Like, yeah, there's a lot of crossover, language differences, cultural differences, past experiences, but generalizing them, like the students and their experiences, effectively justifies ignoring the need to treat students like individuals and not a homogenous community group, which you would never get with non-Indigenous students. For example, A 1994 Indigenous education policy says Aboriginal students learn best by tactile, visual, and oral methods, not by the use of written English normal to most schools. Most do not work well in large groups and place little value on the material possessions of schooling, for example, books, pens. This policy was intended to inform, it's supposed to inform the basis of teaching in Bamaga, but to do so, it hinges on otherness and negatively, stereotypically, designed indigenous identity. So just a bonus little question to think about. What do we need to recognize in order to avoid blanket solutions? On my proper second question, should people not of indigenous background have a say in issues like these? And if so, to what extent? How do you think non-indigenous involvement in such issues can work best? Because a lot of academics have written on behalf of indigenous people, and Turner brings this up. She says that she's mindful of her whiteness and her authority to write about or on behalf of indigenous people. And I think the thing is, there's always going to be external involvement in the planning and implementation and community liaison of programs like this one. And I do think that comes from a good place, but they definitely have some responsibilities in terms of, in the process, to make sure that they're not imposing their own ideas of what they think the people need, rather working with them, because so much of history is built on condescending, we know what's best for you. A lot of people don't recognize their privilege and the fact that they can't know what it's like to be on the other end. And there's just a line between giving a voice to the voiceless and speaking over them. But yeah, so Turner said that the program was carried out with the Injinu people's constant input. So take notes, rest of the world. The bottom line is we're not vibing too much with the way Indigenous student identity has been defined by others. Indigenous people do still define themselves, but it's within structures that are outside of their making. They can only construct themselves within this discourse that says they're disadvantaged and failing.